Welcome everybody. Welcome to our webinar today titled Understanding Board Dynamics with the lovely Linda Carroll, who is the CEO of Align Group. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 40 odd minutes. Firstly, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live webinar. During the session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, depending on where the toolbar is. And we'll be answering these during our session, and we'll try to get through as many of these as we have time for in the session. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we of course hope you will do, and as is usual for our webinars, we have a special treat. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper from our friends at Taken Care Of, worth over $400. Now, for those not too familiar with Board Pro, we're a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, and we serve around about 20,000 users around the world and across about 26 different countries. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with, you guessed it, clever software, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. So let me now introduce our great speaking panel today, our discussion panel. Linda Carroll is, of course, the CEO of Align Group. Linda has over 20 years governance experience combined with over 30 years working with boards, CEOs and senior management, aligning strategy, governance, culture, and performance. Linda's experience spans the wider state sector and not-for-profit boards, and she's also an accredited foresight practitioner through the Institute of Future in California, United States. Good afternoon to you, Linda.
Kia ora. Thank you, Sean.
Stephen Bowman is Managing Director of Conscious Governance, brings a huge wealth of experience in board reviews and strategic planning. Stephen has a wealth of governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Kia ora to you, Stephen.
And hello, everyone from around the world.
Henri Elliott is the founder and managing director of Board Dynamics, accredited mediator and author of the best-selling governance book, Board Shorts. Henri is a chartered fellow of the Institute of Directors in New Zealand, holds an LLB honours from the University of London, Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from McGill University, MBA from Richmond University, Masters in Commercial and Corporate Law from the University of Auckland, postgraduate diploma in entrepreneurship in the University of Cambridge, and a Masters in Sustainability Leadership from the University of Cambridge. Henri has an extensive governance experience for organisations both in New Zealand and North America, and his current directorships include chairman of Bell Boss Group, Dodson Motorsport, and Hill Farrance Venture Capital. Good afternoon to you, Henri, and welcome. This is your first time with us.
It is. Good afternoon, everyone.
So for the next 40 odd minutes, just relax, sit back, listen, and add to the discussion by asking as many questions as you would like. Just type them into the Q&A box. A full recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck and the white paper authored by Linda, will be sent to you at the conclusion of today's session. So for now, I will hand over to Linda.
Thanks so much, Sean. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to start off just by thanking my panel, my fellow panel members, because I think that we're going to get some wonderful stories and fabulous experience from them in our panel discussions. So yeah, it's great to have you both along. So if we start off with the purpose of today, which is really to look at understanding the key ingredients for effective board dynamics and what your role as a board member can be to contribute to those effective boardroom dynamics. Because of course we know that we can have the best skills, experience and technical backgrounds in the room, but if we can't work well together, then we lose that opportunity to harness those skills and experience and actually make great decisions. So it's really important that we are clear on why we want to worry about this and how we can contribute, because so often we think, oh, well, that's the chair's role, but in actual fact, it's not. We all have a responsibility for the successful operation of the board. So then let's talk about, well, what is the board? Why does it exist? And I love going back to the IOD of New Zealand, seeing we've got so many Australians with us today. The IOD, Institute of Directors in New Zealand, talks about the board's purpose as being 4 pillars. The first is determining purpose. The second is about culture, so organizational values and an effective governance culture, which this falls very into very clearly. Holding to account, and that's holding management to account to deliver on that strategy and uphold the culture. And finally, to ensure that your compliance responsibilities are being upheld. So if that's what the purpose of the board is, then you're going to be making a lot of decisions around that board table. And what that means is you need to have a really good process for decision making, as well as content to make those decisions. And when we're talking about process, one of the things that I find really interesting is that by the time we're 30, our neural pathways are basically pretty well set. So if we are presented with a problem or we've got an issue to deal with, then the first thing we do is we default to the way that we work out our problems. And that might be like my dad, who would always have a clean piece of paper and a sharp pencil, or it might be some other fabulous way that you actually go to resolving issues or thinking about problems. But we go to those thinking patterns. And the only way to break our regular pattern is to actually have quite robust dialogue and constructive challenge and debate. And that is why there's so much in the arena of governance nowadays that talks about the importance of diversity in the boardroom. And it's diversity of thought as opposed to any other kind of diversity. But we get diversity of thought by having people who are different backgrounds. You know, they've come from different jobs. They may have different ages, ethnicity, gender, all of these differences that makes that diversity of thought happen. So we know that we want to actually have diversity in the boardroom. And what happens with diversity is we don't get groupthink, yay, but we do have that opportunity for people to have quite different views on things. And we need to manage those differences really carefully so that they don't break into conflict. And so Pete Singhi, who actually has this model here from the 5th discipline, talks about the different ways to make decisions. And he talks about discussion, which in his model is you put forward your point of view, and then the rest of the conversation is basically trying to win people over to your point of view. And he thinks you don't get the best decisions doing that. He says the best decisions come from dialogue. And dialogue is when you approach a particular discussion or a particular, not discussion, dialogue, a particular conversation and decision by actually presenting the issue or the problem definition, and then working together with curious inquiry to uncover different opportunities to actually resolve that problem. And so he talks about giving good feedback, about structured conversations, about building on each other's ideas. And so very much focusing on the process of the conversation as opposed to focusing on merely the content. So it's 2 things that we need to be thinking about, because with dialogue, his research is showing that you get the best and highest quality decisions. So I might just pause there, because I am sure that the panel members, actually I might just talk about consensus, because that's the other thing that's really interesting in this, is when we're making decisions, are we talking about consensus, and what does consensus actually mean? And in a board context, where one of the key ingredients for success as a board is collective responsibility for decisions, then we need to understand what consensus is. And consensus doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to agree, but we all have to be able to live with the actual decision taken. So in the boardroom, we have really good dialogue. We really uncover with curious inquiry why people might think the ways they think. And at the end of the day, the decision is taken, and we all have to live with that decision. If we are really uncomfortable with it, we can get that noted in the minutes. But at the end of the day, we need to walk out of that boardroom and be able to promote and support that decision. And if you can't, then you actually don't have many options available to you apart from resigning. So it's quite a key thing to understand that consensus doesn't mean everyone agrees, but everyone lives with it. And in the argy-bargy of the boardroom, we need to actually operate well with good board dynamics. And we're going to talk about some ingredients for that in a moment. But before I do that, shall I hand over to the panel members and see what examples and times they've had on their boards dealing with making good decisions within a diverse board.
Henry, you kick off.
Oh, thank you. So there are countless examples, but if you look from a commercial lens initially, the appointment of directors and that process on looking at board composition and the culture of the board and the value alignment of the directors is critical. Getting to know each other is important to develop a healthy and a robust board effectiveness, but also the right board dynamics. What's interesting is that if people are not self-aware and check their ego at the door, you often have a lot of disruptive board environments. And just a quick anecdote, and I'll pass this on to Steve, is that we often see this in family boardroom settings, where they'll continue the board meeting outside the boardroom on the weekends as their family members, often siblings, and they have to manage the different hats that they wear. And then also settings where if the chair is not effective, you'll have challenges around the boardroom dynamics because often the silent ones say nothing, the introverts, and the extroverts speak very loudly. And then having that balance, all the voices are heard to make sure you have real consensus versus a loud majority and the silent minority isn't happy.
We do a lot of board reviews, and the most common commentary from directors when we ask them for insights for their fellow directors is either, we'd like to hear more from you because your diverse views aren't being articulated because you feel as if you can only talk about the things that you that people think that you're on the board to do. So if you're from a particular group or whatnot, you can only talk about things from that group's perspective. So one of the things that we find is diversity of view is also about speaking up as well, but having that safe place where people can speak up. The second most common comment that we get from directors is because boards these days are much more diverse than they've ever been before, there is more focus on people respecting that and leveraging it. And many people have no idea how to respect or leverage this diversity. So one of the most common things that we hear other directors requesting of their fellow directors is listen for the point of view and don't attack the person. Listen for the point of view and ask yourself questions around that. And so I think there's an ever-increasing focus around board tables of people being more self-aware, and if they're not, then at least the chair, or if not the annual board review, should assist that director to be a little more self-aware and how they deal with these diverse points of view. Linda.
Yeah, look, great points, both of you. Thank you so much. And Henry, we're going to actually go through now into talking about relationships. And you've picked up on a really important point there, that we need to get to know each other. And so if we could have the next slide, Sean, that'd be great. So what we're talking about when we're talking about good relationships is relationships based on trust. And you might say, well, you know, why is this important in a boardroom? But it has to be there because if we don't have trusting relationships, then we're not going to feel comfortable having constructive challenge, and we're not going to feel comfortable having robust debate. And if we don't have either of those things, we're not going to actually make the best decision. So one of the things that I find really helpful is this particular model. Now, this came from David Maister in his book, The Trusted Advisor. And it was actually developed by a chap called Charles Green. And I use it a lot when I'm going in to help boards who are dysfunctional, because it gives you a great model for identifying what is the actual problem here. Have we got the right people on the board? And that speaks to the credibility. So are people at the table because of the value that they bring to the boardroom? So they've been appointed because of their skill set, because of their backgrounds, and they've actually got a place at the table because of that. And it's really important when we're going through induction processes to bring on new people that we provide an opportunity for everybody in the room to talk about where they've come from and why they're there and what benefit they see themselves bringing to the board. So that opportunity to show their credentials almost, so that everyone owns the place they have at the table. The second point is reliability. And I'm sure you know what that means. So that's about, have you read all the papers, or do you only read the paper that you were appointed to the board on the skill set of? So the accountant or the IT person who only reads the stuff about the money or the technology. Or do you read all the papers? And I'm sure all of us can think about times where it's obvious people haven't actually opened the papers. So that reliability of being well prepared for the meeting, if you're on a subcommittee, actually being prepared for those and feeding the information from those subcommittees back into the board and so on. So that's reliability. The next one is a little odd in terms of its title, intimacy. But it's really interesting, intimacy, because this is the one that Henri was talking about in terms of what is it that this whole person is about and how do I get to know this person, rather than solely the person who's sitting at the board table. And the term that Charles has used is intimacy. And this is an interesting one because it is actually very common that I go into dysfunctional boards and I find that it is this ingredient which is missing. And I'll give you an example. So there was a organization, very large national organization that had just merged. And it was maybe their third meeting, I think, and I'd been asked to come in by the chair to run a strategy session to try to, through doing that, uncover what is the problem. And all of the people on the board were incredibly skilled, very highly regarded, and were there and owned their place at the table in terms of credibility and reliability. But I could tell that I thought what the issue was by after morning tea, because one person immediately stepped out to answer their phone and make phone calls at morning tea. By lunchtime, I was certain I knew what the problem was because the same person was out there making phone calls and answering emails at lunchtime. I never saw them interact with the rest of the board at all. After the board meeting or the strategy day, they were meant to be going out for drinks and dinner. That person packed their bag, thanked everybody for a really productive board meeting, exclaimed about how much they loved working with this team, and then left. So it was intimacy that was missing, and that was the crux of the problem. So I think putting in place opportunities for board members to come together outside of the boardroom is critical, so we get to know the whole person. And the last one here is self-orientation or self-interest, and there has to be none of that. And it's interesting in today's social media environment where so many times we see posts of, I am loving being blah, 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 or whatever. And it's about, now, it's fine to do that, but have you joined a board solely to be able to promote the fact that you're on that board? Or have you joined the board because you are acting in the best interests of that entity and of the board? So by having those ingredients and no self-orientation, you can be assured that your relationships have a foundation of trust that will withstand those really strong debates and those constructive challenges, and people won't take it personally, as Steve was saying. They'll say, oh, I can understand why they are querying my thought process on that, rather than thinking it's about them. And that means we don't fall into conflict. And come to the next slide, Sean. And
Linda,
conflict,
can we just explore a couple of these things here? Because some of the practical things that boards can do to actually, particularly in the level of intimacy, after COVID, we've found this is the biggest complaint. We just don't know our people. We just don't know our fellow board members. We just don't know them. We meet, and that's about all. And having dinners is part of it, and catching up in social events, but there's a couple of areas that we've found boards are putting in place that make a huge difference. Simple things like, for example, asking all directors to provide their CV. Oh, yeah. Even if it's a one-pager, rather than here I am and all you know about me is what you see at the moment, but actually have something about a little bit about their background and maybe where they've been in the past and those sorts of things. So that's one thing that's very, very simple to do. And then the other thing is to actually have a space at the start of each year where you actually ask the directors. So, my favorite question as a chair always used to be, so what would you personally like to get out of this year's service on this board? And so we start to get to know the person a little bit more. And all of these take very little time, but they make such a huge difference. Henry, what have you found that can be useful in this space?
A number of things. So we're involved in also evaluating board performance and working with functional, effective and dysfunctional boards. And to the point earlier is they don't know each other. And there's always a barrier for people to get to know each other if they're very time poor. So we go back to even the appointment process. Do you have time for this board? And if you make the time, commit to it and be honest about it. What we found is a useful technique outside of what you mentioned earlier around who you are is the social activity in a way where we'll have an outsider facilitate a bit of team building with the board, as you often do with exec teams, and they actually get to know each other. And when they also will fail at exercises and learn from it. So they sort of the emperor's clothing. They actually can see people as they are as a human being and not the facade they sometimes put on. In some cases, we call it celebrity directors inside the boardroom and outside. And actually, they are real people like you and I.
We have a number of questions, team. So can we get into those, Linda?
Yeah, absolutely.
First from Clarice, I think that's how you pronounce the name. What strategies can be put in place to discourage directors' group thinking?
I can have a quick go if you like.
Great.
Go on, Ree.
Several things. One is a chair should speak very little typically during a board meeting. I mean, statistics show 5 to 10% of the time. Obviously, it depends on the organization and what's on the agenda. I think it's learning how, as a chair, to allow the person to speak, but have them stop if they're rambling on and encourage the next person around the table. Having a sidebar with the person at the right time, not before or after the meeting, but at a coffee catch-up, saying, listen, we really appreciate your enthusiasm. You have a lot to say, but we want to ensure that others have a perspective, so we avoid, to the point of the question, groupthink. You want to mitigate a dominant voice that potentially could be perceived as a bully or threatening, or they must know best, so I'll rely on them. So there's also a gap in education sometimes in training for directors. Steve?
Yeah, I think the other technique that some boards have used, particularly with really important strategic decisions they need to get into, is they actually allocate a director as the black hat, so that they can actually challenge assumptions. And one of my favorite questions as a director always, I mean, my view is that my gift as a director is not what I say, it is the questions that I've asked that no one else thought of asking. And so I'm always looking at what questions can I ask that would actually get us to reflect rather than just agree. What's that famous phrase? If all of us agree, then only one of us is necessary.
Yeah.
Linda.
Oh, look,
we have another. Go ahead,
sorry,
Linda.
Sean. No. We'll do the second question if you like.
We have 3 or 4 questions, which I'll try and get quickly. This is from Bree in relation to intimacy. She asks or says, what do you do if you just plain don't like the person and don't really want to get to know them?
Oh, yeah. Well, you're on the board and you're acting in the best interests of the entity and the best interests of the board. You don't need to personally like people, but you do need to actually understand that the whole package makes for success. And so what that means is that you don't personally need to like them, but you need to know who they are. You need to understand what their drivers are. And it's only through actually knowing them as people that you can work out how best to work with them. So, yeah, you don't have to like them.
Anthony's asking, any suggestions as to how to integrate diversity of thought attributes into board skills and attributes matrix as part of a director selection process? Who would like to try and answer that one?
Well, I can have a crack. Oh, Henry, do you want to?
No,
have
no,
a
no,
go?
no, no, that's all right. You go, Linda. I'll go after
Um,
you this time.
Okay, so how to, just to recap, so the question is, how do we get diversity of thought as part of the
Selection.
competencies that we select
Yeah.
directors on?
Correct.
Okay, so when you're looking at competency frameworks, there's a whole lot of competencies in there that are generic around, strategic decision making, emotional agility, business acumen, and so on. And those are all critical. And then you have your technical competencies, which is, are you an accountant? Do you understand the sector and so on? And then I have, in my framing, I have another category, which is who do we have on the board table and what are we missing? So, and that is more generic, and it depends on who's coming on and who's coming off as to the specificity that you can get to. And so when I'm looking at a board, I'm looking at where have people come from. I'm looking at their background, roles that they've been in, the sectors they've been in. I'm looking at the constitution and the strategy and where the business is at and its growth and so on. And that basically gives you really clear indicators of the types of competencies that you need and the skill sets that you need. And also, of course, what community you're working in, who is your client base and so on. Henri.
If I can add to that, there's a few things to think through here is yes, you have a skills matrix present, but you want to look ahead at the future and looking at where you want to go as an organization. What's the purpose of the organization? And you have soft skills and technical skills of directors who've applied for a role, but you want to tease out beyond why they want to be on this board and where their value add is what do they do outside the boardroom and what they do outside their day-to-day job, or if they're professional director, what their interests are, to see if there will be real diversity of thought, not just diversity of thought within a small parameter. So we want to see the bigger and greater person, which we often use in recruitment at university. So I sit on a selection panel at the University of Cambridge, and we look at undergrads and want to see what they've done outside of their academic time and where they've volunteered, but have they actually volunteered and done real volunteering work as opposed to something that looks like it is. So how real is that experience? That's important to us for real diversity of thought.
Thanks, Henri. Any strategy for managing, where are we now? I've just lost the question. This is from Bree. So to rephrase the question, so it's not so negative, how to manage to convince that there are strengths diversity beyond professional board members? That's from Bree.
Can you ask it again, Sean?
Yes, so to rephrase the question, so it's not so negative, how to manage to convince that there are strengths diversity beyond professional board members?
Okay, let me have first crack at that one. So with many boards, I found they've fallen into a couple of traps. Trap number one is it's really hard to find good board members. So that's already telling you where their thinking is. And the response always to that from me is, no, there are many, many very good board members out there. You need to be worthy of them joining you. So what can you put in place to actually show that those directors will not only come on and contribute, but they will learn stuff from your board as well? If you get that right, then you'll have no trouble finding really good board members. They're out there. There's never been more really good board members out there. So now the diversity of thought side of things is we are here to create the future for our communities. That's our job. We're not here to meet. That's not our job. We're not here to make sure that staff are busy. We're here to create the future, and we need to make choices around creating those futures. So we need to have as many points of view that help us get to the underlying key strategic choice that we've got in front of us. And to do that, we need a good variety of experiences, skills, backgrounds, lived experience, all of that, to enable us to work out what are the choices that are going to actually create the future. So that's a compelling argument that, particularly if you focus on we're here to create the future, what are the skills and experiences we need to help feed into that? Linda?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Sorry, Sean.
Oh, no, Linda. No, sorry. I was going to add to that really quickly. If you have in the back of your mind what Steve said is around attract, retain, refresh, we also want to create a training environment for next generation of directors, because one of the biggest barriers I hear often in the larger corporate boardrooms, oh, they have no governance experience. So how do we overcome that barrier so we can start having diversity and a water pool? And Steve's right, is be open. Don't have that mindset of there's no one available. They are. It's how you do the search effectively.
And if I just add one more very practical component to this, I would say 95% of boards do their induction not terribly well of new directors. And there's two things that they're missing that make all of the difference. And these are very simple things to put in place. Number one, develop up a mentoring or a buddy system. And number two, have your induction program spread over a 12-month period. Now, if you do those two things together and you hold both the mentor and the mentee accountable, then you will be able to actually help shape and create a director who is willing to be all that they can be, with the assistance of another director who can help shape and mentor them in a way where they can feel free to speak up. They can actually show their experience. They can make sure that they're contributing in a way that's really powerful. But to do that, you need to both give them time over a 12-month period and also support them through a well-managed mentor-mentee program.
I'd just like to add to that, that's great thoughts, Stephen, is that you need to be very careful about what you load at the front end of the induction. Because people, as soon as they are appointed to a board, they actually are going to be party to all of the decisions made, regardless of if it's their first day sitting at the board table. And so that means there are some fundamental things as a board member you need to know before you even sit at that board table for your first meeting. So make sure when you're structuring that 12-month program, you've got the order of information that you're giving people correct. Great idea, Stephen.
And can I just say to Sean, if anyone's interested, I've got a really good just a one-page program on the roles and responsibilities of board mentors and board mentees, which we can send out as part of the follow-up after this, if they like.
Great, thanks, Steve.
That'd be good. Yeah, that'd be great.
Back to you, Linda.
Okay, so I always think that it's quite helpful to talk about what common sources of conflict are, and to actually state up front that not all conflict is bad. And one of the things that I have experienced with poor chairmanship is chairs who avoid conflict. If chairs avoid conflict, then you get greater conflict and you get poor conflict as opposed to good conflict. So having robust discussions, disagreements, if you don't have them at the board table, that's a problem. But you don't want them to, as Stephen said earlier, they don't want to move into the personal. So common sources of conflict, a desire for control, interpersonal issues, factions, poor communication, the ineffective chair, of which I'm sure we've all experienced, and a lack of role clarity is another one. So I'm sure that you've all experienced these sorts of examples where there's conversations that are happening outside of the boardroom where people are building up their cohort so that when they come to the next board meeting, they're voting en masse as to what they're actually wanting to happen. And those sorts of situations can cause conflict because the conversation and the learning and the curious inquiry isn't happening for everybody at the same time. And it becomes very clear very quickly that those sorts of things are happening. The other thing that is quite interesting is the poor communication that can happen, especially when you have subcommittees. So when subcommittees are feeding back to the wider board, I have experienced times where those subcommittees aren't actually feeding back effectively. And so they're recommending to the board that certain decisions are taken, but they're not providing enough information for the board to have an assurance that the recommendation is the right recommendation. And that means the board wants to go all the way back into where the subcommittee's already been to actually get all the information to feel sure that they're making the right decision. Those are just a couple of things. I'm sure Stephen and Henri have other examples, of conflict situations on the boards they've been a part of.
Henri, go for it.
Thanks, Steve. I have way too many examples for the time we have, but at a high level, a common theme that I've seen is ulterior motivation or motives from one director who's a shareholder as well. In one case, it was to the point of they were looking to pretty much take over the whole company. Another case where having the right creative tension in the boardroom was great, but it got to a level of too creative where chairs were thrown around the room, literally, and people ducked for cover. And that meeting was stopped immediately, and the board was disestablished and replaced a month later. Those are war stories. But what I see most often, and I'll hand it over to Steve, is that conflict avoidance is pretty common business culture, and I've seen it in a lot in New Zealand and in Canada as well, as everyone knows each other with 2 degrees of separation. So they don't really want to speak their mind or offend the person because they're going to see them on the football pitch the next day, at tennis on the weekend, or the school prize giving, etc. So that is tough, and they don't actually want to express how they feel ever. And that what happens is it translates into passive aggressiveness. And it may come out through an explosion, i.e. the chairs, pardon the pun, being thrown, or if they've had too much to drink at a function and then it all goes a little bit too wild. So cut long story short, you want a right level of creative tension in the room that's healthy, but as a chair, your role is to manage it effectively. And if you're the issue, then through the board evaluation process, hopefully that refresh of the chair will occur. You don't want a chair who's like a mayor that it's hard to remove. Over to you, Steve.
Henri, you've covered it. Thank you. Linda, yours.
Oh, thank you. So,
And we didn't rehearse that, by the way, at all.
So, so we have here, and I think that Henri actually picked up on a couple of things. We've got the CEO or the chairs dominating the meeting, and I'd just like to pick up on what Henri said earlier on, which is in a good board meeting, you will very rarely know what the chair's thinking. You'll very rarely hear what the chair thinks should happen. It's quite often that you'll actually find that they summarize what the conversation is and they support it. But because they're not sitting there and giving you their view first, you may not actually know what their actual view is because someone else has picked up on it already. So that's the other side of the chair's role within the meeting. So not dominating. People talking over each other is one, and that really requires sound and effective chairmanship or chairpersonship. One director dominating a topic, taking turns, which is often confused with true participation. So I don't know if you've been in those board meetings where the chair says, right, well, we'll go around the table and hear what people think about this paper. And everybody has a turn, and that's not true participation. You go around, you have your turn, somebody says something on the other side of the table, but you've already had your turn, so you don't have an opportunity unless you butt in, and then that is seen as butting in. Those sorts of things create problems. And of course, new directors tending to contribute less. So it's actually good to create space and invite people to contribute. So that brings us, I suppose, to the role of the chair. And I know that we've all been in situations where we've had poor chairs, and that means that we have to step up and facilitate. But we also have to recognise what is our role as chair if we are the chair. And there's all the stuff that happens prior to the meeting with the agendas, making sure the agendas, the annual board work plan and so on, enable the board as a whole to meet its fiduciary responsibilities and all the things that it actually has to do. That the board papers are good, that they're actually taking the strategy and taking you on your journey forward, and so on. During the meetings, the facilitation of the meeting is key. And I've been in a situation where we had one of those black hatters, Stephen, and every time this poor person opened their mouth, the people would sit back, cross their arms and roll their eyes. And in the end, as chair, we actually had a really open and honest conversation about the value brought to the table with a black hatter, and how we actually had somebody who was always looking at the risk, always ensuring we had the finances to do what we wanted to do, always thinking about the hard things. and how they brought value to the board. And that is the role of the chair, because what happens if you don't address those is that individual will probably resign because they won't be able to contribute. So really important facilitation of the meetings, having sound board process for decisions, and we've talked about that already, and the importance of collective responsibility and everybody understanding what expectations the board has of each member. And then post-meeting, of course, there's a board chair's role is making sure those minutes accurately reflect what happened in the meeting, and they're not too big and they're not too small, and that they actually are just right. And it's really hard, and it is an incredible skill. But I think that's something that the chair has an important role to play in. But then finally, and most importantly with this particular topic, is dealing with inappropriate board behaviour. And that might be anything from those terrible examples you provided, Henry, of people throwing things and so on, through to just people being downright rude, or people speaking inappropriately outside of the boardroom. All of these things can contribute, and let's just hope that you have a good chair, and if not, that you can actually support your chair by having conversations over cups of coffee.
Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes for a couple of extra questions, unless Stephen, Henri, you'd like to comment on that last segment?
Keep going.
Okay, it's tricky when some directors are elected by the members, particularly in an organisation that has a couple of factions. How do you best deal with directors who cannot set aside those faction interests rather than the organisational best interest?
Oh, I can
Steve,
give it a quick go. You go, Steve.
Okay, so one of the things is call them out on it on a regular basis. The other one is to invite the other directors to understand when someone is speaking from that particular factional point of view. The other one, which is really interesting, and we've had to do this quite recently, is to get all the directors to truly understand the notion of conflict of interest. A lot of directors don't get it. Now, conflict is real, perceived, or potential. And we as a board actually have the ultimate tools to be able to deal with any perceived conflict, because we can, there's a number of things that we can do. Now, there's a really good white paper that Board Pro have got, which covers conflict of interest in a lot of detail. But get to understand how you can deal with conflict of interest and call people out on that. Henri.
Yeah, one of the things, well, can I just pop in there about the conflict of interest before handing over to Henri, is to make sure that you have an interest register, not a conflict of interest register. Because when people only put down what they believe is a perceived or potential conflict, they make that decision on their own. And that means the rest of the board is ignorant of what their real conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest are. And if you put it into an interest register that's shared with all the board, you can overcome some of that, can't you, Stephen? Sorry, Henri.
Well, sometimes, unless someone refuses to see it as a conflict. We just had one recently where the CEO of another organisation was sitting on this particular board, and they refused to acknowledge they had a conflict. And so we had to actually recuse them from 9/10 of the board meeting and not send them 9/10 of the board papers until they actually got the point.
Yeah, I'll quickly jump in for 10 seconds and get another question in. Basically, for an interest register, make sure it's maintained regularly. I see them often quite stale and out of date if people forget to review it. And second, when it comes to this type of conflict of interest not being understood or not wanting to be understood, is training. Just again to remind them until it finally sinks in.
One last question then, Ting. We're keen to understand how you would review the chair to support them understand their effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Board
evaluation.
So, I'm happy to give that one a quick go. So there's a few parts there. There's a typical board evaluation through a 360 that is completed anonymously by the members around the table, but also a one-to-one interview with the chair. And another technique is, if there's any resistance around a board evaluation, is to have a third party facilitate a roundtable discussion with the board around whole of board performance, individual feedback about each other together if you can. But if you do have a problematic chair that doesn't want to be evaluated nor the board to be evaluated, it might be too late.
Yeah, we often recommend when those things come up is that all chairs of all committees, including the board chair, do a one-day chairing course. So they get to mix it with other chairs and they get to hear maybe different points of view about what it means to be a chair. Very powerful.
Very true. Learn from each other.
And yeah, I think you've answered it.
Is that a
Excellent.
bonus question? A bonus question? Or are we done?
We're done. We're right on time. So thanks, everybody. That was the final webinar in our Governance Made. Actually, it's not, to be frank. We have one more coming up on the 6th of December, which we're really looking forward to. Now, just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey. Go into that draw to win the $400 gift hamper. We'll announce the winner. What's the day today? Thursday, tomorrow, Friday. Thanks for your attendance, everybody. Thank you, Linda, Stephen and Henri, for your time and information today. We'll see you at our next webinar, everybody. Thank you very much.